Hi guys, sorry to interrupt your viewing, but please subscribe to the channel and like this video. Thank you.
You ever find out a secret so shocking that it flips your entire world upside down? Well, that's what happened when I discovered my stepmom changed my late father's will to cut me out entirely. But here's the kicker. She doesn't know I have a copy of the original. My dad's funeral was one of the hardest days of my life. He passed away suddenly from a heart attack, and the loss hit me like a freight train. He wasn't just my dad. He was my rock, my mentor, and the one person who always had my back. As I sat in the pew, staring at the closed casket, a mix of grief and disbelief washed over me. It didn't feel real. He had just celebrated his 62nd birthday a few months ago, laughing and cracking jokes about how he wasn't ready to retire from life yet. And now here we were. Karen, my stepmom, was strangely calm throughout the service. She had been married to my dad for 7 years, and while we weren't exactly close, I figured she was grieving in her own way. Her face remained composed, almost detached, as if she was watching someone else's life unfold. I told myself not to judge. Grief hits people differently. But there was something about her demeanor that gnawed at me. After the service, close family and friends gathered at my dad's house. It was surreal being back in the place where we'd spent countless Sundays watching football, grilling burgers, and laughing until our stomachs hurt. But the warmth of those memories felt muted under the weight of his absence. As the evening wound down, Karen announced that the lawyer would read the will. Her tone was firm, almost businesslike, as if she had been waiting for this moment. We all gathered in the living room. Karen took the seat at the head of the table, a position my dad used to occupy. Her presence felt commanding, even intimidating. The lawyer, a middle-aged man with a receding hairline, opened a folder and began to read. As he spoke, my chest tightened. Dad had left the house, his cars, and the bulk of his savings to Karen. To me, his only child, he left a few sentimental items and a modest trust fund that wouldn't even cover a year's rent. I sat there, stunned, as the words washed over me. This couldn't be right. My dad had always been clear that he wanted me to be taken care of, that everything he built was for our family's future. This didn't sound like him at all. Karen, meanwhile, sat there with a faint smile, nodding along as if everything was going exactly as planned. I caught her stealing glances at me, her expression a mix of satisfaction and feigned sympathy. Your father wanted to make sure you had these special items, she said when the lawyer finished. Her voice dripped with condescension. They were very important to him. I could barely muster a response. My mind was spinning. How could Dad do this? Was I being punished for something? Did he think I didn't care about him enough? As the guests began to leave, Karen approached me. I know this might be hard for you to understand, she said, placing a cold hand on my shoulder. But your father trusted me to handle things the way he saw fit. He wanted to make sure I was secure. Her words felt rehearsed, as if she had prepared for this conversation long in advance. I nodded numbly, unable to process everything. That night, I lay awake in my childhood bedroom, staring at the ceiling. Memories of my dad played like a slideshow in my mind. The way he used to hug me so tight I could barely breathe, his goofy laugh, the way he'd ruffle my hair and call me kiddo. None of it matched the man who would leave me with practically nothing while handing everything to Karen. The next morning, I sat in the kitchen nursing a cup of coffee, the pit in my stomach growing heavier. I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. Dad and I might not have seen each other as often as we used to, but we were close. He was always transparent about his plans, and he had assured me many times that his estate was set up to protect me. My gut told me this wasn't just a matter of grief clouding my judgment. There was more to this story, and I needed to figure out what it was. The weeks following my dad's funeral passed in a haze of grief and unanswered questions. Karen, on the other hand, was the picture of efficiency. Within days, she was making changes to the house, replacing furniture, rearranging rooms, and even talking about selling the vintage car my dad loved so much. It was as though she was eager to erase his presence and put her own stamp on everything. I tried to focus on work and keep myself busy, but every time I saw Karen flaunting her newfound status as the sole owner of everything my dad had built, a gnawing frustration bubbled inside me. Dad had always been clear. He wanted to leave behind a legacy for me. He used to talk about how everything he worked for would one day be mine to grow and protect. So, why did his will leave me with next to nothing? I started second-guessing myself. Maybe I hadn't been there for Dad as much as I should have. Maybe he felt I didn't deserve more. But no matter how I spun it, none of it added up. Dad was thoughtful, meticulous even, when it came to planning for the future. If something didn't make sense, it probably wasn't right. One night, as I wandered through the house, trying to reconnect with memories of my dad, I found myself in his study. The room had always been his sanctuary, a place filled with books, framed photos, and his favorite leather chair. I sat at his desk, running my hands over the worn wood, and opened a few drawers looking for something, anything, that might help me feel closer to him. That's when I noticed the locked drawer on the left side of the desk. It wasn't obvious at first. The keyhole was small and partially hidden by the way the desk was designed. My heart skipped a beat. I had never seen it before, and curiosity got the better of me. Finding the key became an obsession. I searched every nook and cranny of the study, from the shelves to the desk organizer, but nothing turned up. Then it hit me, Dad's old toolbox in the garage. He'd shown me once how to open its secret compartment, where he kept his most important stuff. Sure enough, after a bit of fumbling, I found a small, tarnished key tucked away inside. Back in the study, my hands shook as I unlocked the drawer. Inside was a neatly labeled folder that read, Will and Testament. My pulse quickened. Why would Dad keep a copy of his will here if Karen had the official version? I opened the folder, and my jaw dropped. This document, dated 6 months before his death, was nothing like the one read at the lawyer's office. In this version, Dad had left me the house, most of his savings, and his cherished vintage car. Karen wasn't excluded, but her share was reasonable, a fraction of what she had claimed in the other version. I reread the will several times, my mind racing with questions. This version felt like the Dad I knew, fair, loving, and protective of me. But why wasn't this the version the lawyer had read? And how had Karen ended up with everything? The realization hit me like a truck. Something wasn't right. Someone had tampered with Dad's wishes. And the only person who stood to gain was Karen. The discovery opened a floodgate of emotions, relief, anger, and an overwhelming sense of betrayal. I wanted to march up to Karen and confront her right then and there, but I knew I had to be smart about this. If she had gone to the lengths of altering a legal document, who knew what else she was capable of? I spent the next few days poring over the will, comparing every detail to the version the lawyer had read. The discrepancies were glaring. The phrasing in the fraudulent version was impersonal, even cold, while this original version was undeniably Dad's voice. I started to piece together a timeline. Karen must have gained access to Dad's documents after his death, probably during the chaotic days leading up to the funeral. She had time to swap out the original will and replace it with one that benefited her. But how had she managed to forge Dad's signature and get it notarized? This wasn't just a case of greed. It was fraud, plain and simple. And the more I thought about it, the more furious I became. This wasn't just about money or assets. It was about Karen tarnishing my dad's memory and erasing his true intentions. I couldn't let her get away with it. Late one night, unable to sleep, I found myself sitting at the kitchen table with the original will in front of me. My mind was racing with questions. Who could I trust? Should I go straight to the lawyer? What if Karen had paid him off? Just then, Karen walked into the kitchen. She froze when she saw me sitting there with the folder. For a split second, her face betrayed a flicker of panic, but she quickly composed herself. Couldn't sleep? She asked casually, pouring herself a glass of water. I didn't respond right away. I was too busy watching her, trying to gauge her reaction. Just going through some of Dad's old things, I said finally. Her eyes darted to the folder on the table, and I could see her mind working. She said nothing, but the tension in the room was palpable. I could tell she wanted to ask what I'd found, but she didn't dare. As she turned to leave, I made a decision. I wasn't going to confront her yet, not until I had all the pieces. This wasn't just about exposing the truth. It was about making sure she paid for what she had done. The morning after finding the original will, I couldn't keep still. Every time I thought about Karen sitting smugly at the head of the table, dictating my father's legacy, like it was her birthright, my blood boiled. The anger mixed with a gnawing sense of unease. This wasn't just a betrayal of me, but of my dad. He trusted her, and she'd taken advantage of that trust in the worst possible way. I knew I had to confront her, but I also knew Karen was slippery. She had a way of twisting words and turning situations in her favor. If I was going to stand a chance of getting the truth out of her, I needed to stay calm and controlled. So, instead of storming into the house and accusing her outright, I decided to meet her on neutral ground. I called and asked if we could talk over coffee. Karen's response was almost too casual. Of course, she said, her tone dripping with false warmth. I'm glad you're finally ready to talk things through. We met at a small coffee shop in town, one my dad used to love. The place had an old-fashioned charm, with wooden booths and the smell of freshly baked pastries lingering in the air. Karen was already there when I arrived, sitting at a corner table with a latte in front of her. She greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "You look tired," she said as I sat down. "I've been worried about you. This whole process has been hard on all of us." I ignored the bait and set the folder on the table between us. "We need to talk about this," I said. Her smile faltered for a split second, but she quickly recovered. "What's that?" she asked, feigning ignorance. I opened the folder and slid the original will across to her. Karen stared at it for a moment before picking it up, her fingers trembling just slightly. Her eyes darted across the pages, and her expression shifted from confusion to something darker. "Where did you get this?" she demanded, her voice sharper than I'd ever heard it. "In Dad's desk," I replied evenly. "Locked drawer." It was hidden pretty well. Karen placed the will back on the table, her face a mask of forced composure. "I don't know what you think this proves," she said. "Your father made his wishes clear, and the lawyer handled everything by the book." "Did he?" I asked, leaning forward, because this will says something very different. This one sounds like the dad I knew. "So, I'll ask you again. What happened?" She opened her mouth to respond, but no words came out. For the first time, I saw a crack in her armor. Karen wasn't used to being challenged, and it was clear she hadn't expected me to find the original document. She tried to play dumb at first, claiming she had no idea why there would be two versions of the will. "Maybe your dad changed his mind," she suggested with a shrug. "People do that, you know. It's not unusual." I wasn't buying it. "Really?" I asked. "Then why didn't he tell me? Why would he lock this version away and leave the other one for you to present? And how convenient that your version gives you everything while leaving me with scraps." Karen's lips thinned into a straight line. She looked down at the table, her fingers tightening around the edge of her cup. For a moment, I thought she might come clean, but instead, she doubled down. "You have no idea what it's like to manage a household," she snapped. "Your father trusted me to take care of things. He knew I'd make the right decisions. It's not about what's fair, it's about what's practical." Her words hit a nerve. "Practical?" I repeated. "You think it's practical to forge someone's will?" "Because that's exactly what this looks like, Karen. And if you think I'm just going to roll over and accept it, you're dead wrong." Her face flushed, and for a moment, I thought she might lash out. But then she took a deep breath and plastered on a tight smile. "Do what you need to do," she said, her tone icy. "But I'm not going to sit here and be accused of something I didn't do. Your father made his wishes clear, and I've honored them. End of story." With that, she grabbed her purse and stormed out, leaving me alone at the table. I sat there for a long time, staring at the folder in front of me. The confrontation hadn't gone the way I'd hoped. Karen hadn't admitted to anything, but her reaction told me all I needed to know. She was guilty, and she knew it. As I walked back to my car, a sense of determination settled over me. Karen thought she could scare me off or confuse me into backing down, but she was wrong. This wasn't just about me anymore. It was about setting things right for my dad. I decided then and there that I wasn't going to let her get away with it. If Karen wanted a fight, she was going to get one. The weight of my discovery hung over me like a storm cloud as I dialed the number for my dad's lawyer. His name was Henry Barker, and he'd been handling my dad's legal affairs for years. I remembered meeting him once at a family dinner. He'd seemed like a no-nonsense kind of guy, the sort who stuck to the rules. I hoped that was still true. The receptionist transferred my call, and Henry's voice came on the line, calm and professional. "This is Henry Barker." I took a deep breath. "Hi, Mr. Barker, this is your name." "I'm John, last name, S. son. I need to discuss something important regarding my dad's will." His tone softened. "I'm sorry for your loss. What can I help you with?" I explained everything. The reading of the will, my discovery of the original document, and my growing suspicion that something wasn't right. When I mentioned the original will, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. "I think it would be best if we discuss this in person," he said finally. "Can you come to my office tomorrow afternoon?" The next day, I arrived at his office, a modest space in a nondescript building downtown. Henry greeted me at the door, his expression unreadable. As we sat down in his wood-paneled conference room, I pulled out the original will and handed it to him. Henry adjusted his glasses and began reading. As his eyes scanned the pages, his brow furrowed deeper and deeper. Finally, he set the document down and leaned back in his chair. "This isn't the version I filed," he said quietly, almost to himself. "Then where did this one come from?" I asked, leaning forward. Henry sighed and rubbed his temples. "Your stepmother came to me shortly after your father's death," he explained. "She said there was an updated version of the will. She brought a signed copy and insisted that it reflected your father's final wishes. It seemed legitimate. The signatures matched, and it was notarized. I felt a cold knot form in my stomach. So, you didn't question it? He shook his head, looking genuinely regretful. In hindsight, maybe I should have, but at the time, there was no reason to doubt her. Your father was meticulous about his paperwork, and it wasn't unusual for him to make updates to his estate plan. I sat back, trying to process what he was saying. But now that you've seen this, I gestured to the original will on the table. Henry nodded slowly. This changes everything. The language in this document aligns with how your father typically structured his estate. The other version felt less personal, but I chalked that up to it being more business-focused. Now I'm not so sure. The weight of his words settled over the room. I could see the wheels turning in his head as he pieced things together. Did she say anything else when she brought in the updated will? I asked. Henry hesitated. She mentioned wanting to simplify things and ensure there were no complications. At the time, I assumed she was acting in good faith. He glanced at the original will again, his jaw tightening. But if this is authentic, it suggests she deliberately presented a forged document. How can we prove that? I asked, my frustration bubbling to the surface. He leaned forward, resting his elbows on the table. First, we'll need to verify the signatures on both documents. If the signatures on the updated will are forgeries, that's a clear-cut case of fraud. I can also check the notary's credentials to see if there are any discrepancies there. And if it's fraud, then we take this to court, he said firmly. The original will would be reinstated, and your stepmother could face serious legal consequences. As I left his office, my emotions were a mix of anger, relief, and determination. Henry's reaction had validated my suspicions, but it also opened up a whole new set of questions. Karen had clearly gone to great lengths to secure the fraudulent will, and I couldn't help but wonder how far she'd go to protect her secret. That night, as I sat in my apartment staring at the copy of the original will, a thought struck me. What if Karen wasn't acting alone? Forging a will required skill and precision, skills she didn't seem to possess. If someone else had helped her, this could be bigger than I'd imagined. I didn't have all the answers yet, but one thing was clear. This wasn't just about money. It was about my dad's legacy, his final wishes, and the truth. And I wasn't going to stop until I uncovered it all. Waiting for Henry's call felt like an eternity. I needed answers now. The more I thought about Karen's cold demeanor and her suspicious behavior, the more convinced I became that there was more to her story. My dad had been a cautious man. If he trusted Karen enough to marry her, then there must have been something about her that seemed genuine. But had he overlooked something? I pulled out my laptop, determined to dig into Karen's past. She'd always been a bit of an enigma. My dad met her through mutual friends, or at least that's what he told me. Their relationship moved quickly, too quickly in hindsight. Within a year of meeting, they were married, and Karen had seamlessly slid into the role of my stepmother. She was polite but distant, never making much of an effort to bond with me. At the time, I chalked it up to her respecting boundaries, but now I wasn't so sure. I started with the basics, typing her full name into the search bar. The first few results were innocuous, social media profiles and mentions in local community events. But then I stumbled across something that made my heart race. An old newspaper article from a town a few states away. Local man dies in tragic car accident, the headline read. The man's name was Brian Harper, and he was listed as Karen's first husband. According to the article, Brian had died when his car veered off the road and hit a tree. The article mentioned that he was survived by his devoted wife, Karen. There was no suspicion of foul play, and the death was ruled an accident. I sat back, frowning. A car accident wasn't exactly unusual, but something about it felt off. I jotted down the name of the town and kept searching. That's when I found the second article. Man dies in mysterious fall at home, the headline announced. This time, the man's name was Peter Lawrence, Karen's second husband. The article described how Peter had fallen down a flight of stairs in their home, suffering fatal injuries. Once again, Karen was listed as his grieving widow. The article noted that Peter's death had been ruled accidental, though it also mentioned whispers of tension in their marriage. My stomach churned as I pieced it together. 2 husbands, 2 deaths, both under unusual circumstances. The pattern was impossible to ignore. I dug deeper, searching for any other connections between Karen and her late husbands. That's when I found the most damning piece of information yet: probate records for both men. In each case, Karen had inherited significant assets. Brian's estate included a sizable life insurance policy, and Peter had left behind a lucrative real estate portfolio. Suddenly, the pieces started to click. Karen's quick relationship with my dad, her eagerness to control his estate, the discrepancies in the will. It all pointed to a calculated plan. She wasn't just a grieving widow. She was a predator. I couldn't shake the feeling that my dad had been her next target. It was almost as if she followed a script. Charm, marry, inherit, and move on. And now, with my dad gone, she tried to erase his true intentions by forging the will. The weight of the discovery settled heavily on my chest. I thought about the time I'd spent with Karen over the years. There were moments when I'd seen flashes of something colder beneath her polite facade, a sharp comment, a calculated smile, but I'd always dismissed them as quirks of her personality. Now I wondered if I'd been blind to something much darker. I needed more proof. Something concrete that could tie Karen to the forgery or, better yet, to her past husband's deaths. But I couldn't do it alone. I decided to reach out to a private investigator. It felt extreme, but I wasn't dealing with an ordinary situation. If Karen had manipulated my dad's will, there was no telling what else she was capable of. The next day, I met with the investigator, a sharp-eyed woman named Emily who had an air of quiet confidence. I laid everything out for her. The discrepancies in the will, the suspicious deaths of Karen's previous husbands, and my fears about what she might have done to my dad. Emily listened carefully, taking detailed notes. "This is serious," she said when I finished. "If your suspicions are correct, your stepmother could be facing criminal charges. But we need to build a solid case. That means gathering evidence, talking to witnesses, and digging into her financial records." "How long will it take?" I asked, desperate for answers. "It depends," she said, "but I'll start with her previous marriages. If there's a pattern, we'll find it." As I left Emily's office, I felt a mix of relief and dread. Relief that someone was finally helping me, and dread at the possibility of what we might uncover. That night, I couldn't sleep. I kept replaying memories of my dad in my head, searching for any signs that he might have been in danger. Had Karen ever mentioned life insurance or estate planning to him? Had she pressured him into making changes to his will? One memory stood out. A few months before his death, my dad had mentioned feeling stressed. "Karen's been on my case about getting everything in order," he'd said with a laugh. At the time, I thought he was just talking about paperwork, but now I wasn't so sure. The thought made my skin crawl. If Karen had played a role in my dad's death, directly or indirectly, then this wasn't just about the will. It was about justice. A few days later, Emily called with her first update. "You were right," she said. "Karen has a history of suspicious behavior. I found records showing that both of her late husbands had revised their wills shortly before their deaths, leaving her as the primary beneficiary. There's also evidence that she tried to file for additional life insurance policies after their deaths, but they were denied due to inconsistencies in her applications." I felt a cold wave of vindication. "What about my dad?" I asked. "I'm still looking into it," she said. "But if she followed the same pattern, we'll find it." As I hung up, a grim determination settled over me. Karen had taken enough from my family. It was time to stop her. I had just started reviewing the notes Emily sent me about Karen's suspicious history when my phone buzzed on the counter. It was nearly midnight, and I frowned at the sight of "no caller ID" flashing on the screen. For a moment, I debated ignoring it. Late-night calls from unknown numbers rarely brought good news. But something told me to pick up. "Hello," I said cautiously. There was a pause on the other end, followed by the sound of someone clearing their throat. "I know what she did," a shaky voice whispered. My grip on the phone tightened. "Who is this?" The caller ignored my question. "You're digging into Karen, aren't you? Good. Someone needs to stop her." A chill ran down my spine. "How do you know that? Who are you?" "I can't tell you who I am," the voice said hurriedly. "It's not safe. But I used to work with Karen years ago. She's not who she pretends to be." I paced the kitchen, my heart pounding. "What do you mean? What did she do?" The caller hesitated, their breathing audible through the line. "She's skilled," they said finally. "She knows how to manipulate people. I've seen it firsthand. She can charm anyone into doing what she wants, and when she's done with them, she moves on. But she always makes sure she gets what she came for." "What are you talking about?" I pressed. "Be specific. Did she do something illegal?" "She brags about it," the voice continued, ignoring my plea. "About how she can get people to change their wills, make them believe it's their idea. She calls it her long game, says it's all about planting the right seeds, saying the right things at the right time." My stomach churned as the pieces started falling into place. "Are you saying she's done this before?" "Yes," the voice said emphatically. "I don't know everything, but I know enough. She's not just greedy. She's dangerous." I could hear the fear in their voice, but it only made me more frustrated. "Why are you telling me this now? If you know so much, why not come forward?" There was a long pause. Because people who cross Karen don't always come out on top, the voice said quietly. But you have the chance to stop her. Don't waste it. Before I could say another word, the line went dead. I stood there for a long time, staring at the phone in my hand. The call had raised more questions than it answered. Who was this person? How did they know I was investigating Karen? And most importantly, why were they so afraid of her? The phrase long game echoed in my mind. It fit Karen perfectly. Everything about her relationship with my dad now seemed calculated. Her charm, her patience, her subtle insistence on taking control of his affairs. She hadn't just stumbled into his life, she'd targeted him. And if this anonymous caller was telling the truth, she'd done it before. I didn't sleep that night. Instead, I sat at the kitchen table, going over everything I knew about Karen. The pattern was undeniable. 2 deceased husbands, suspicious wills, and now my dad. The anonymous tip confirmed what I had feared. This wasn't just a case of forgery or fraud. This was a methodical, predatory cycle. The next morning, I called Emily to tell her about the tip. She listened intently, asking questions and jotting down notes. This could be a huge break, she said when I finished. If we can figure out who that caller was, they might be able to give us more evidence against Karen. How do we track them down? I asked. It's tricky with a block number, she admitted. But there are ways to trace calls like that. It might take some time, though. I sighed, feeling the weight of it all pressing down on me. What if we can't find them? Then we focus on what we can prove, Emily said firmly. The tip lines up with what we already know. Karen has a pattern, and it's not just a coincidence. If we can show that pattern in court, it could be enough to discredit her. Her confidence was reassuring, but it didn't erase the anger simmering inside me. Karen had taken my dad's trust and twisted it into something ugly. She'd turned his legacy into a game, and she thought she could get away with it. As the days went by, I found myself hyper-aware of Karen's movements. She acted like nothing was wrong, going about her life as if she hadn't stolen everything my dad had worked for. But now, every smile she gave me felt like a taunt, every polite conversation like a reminder of her deceit. I started paying closer attention to her behavior. She spent a lot of time on her phone, always careful to step out of the room when she took a call. She also made frequent trips into town, though she never mentioned where she was going. One afternoon, as she left for another mysterious errand, I decided to follow her. I stayed a few cars behind, my heart racing with adrenaline. She drove to a small cafe on the outskirts of town and parked in the back lot. I watched as she entered the cafe and joined a man at a corner table. He looked professional, dressed in a suit, and they spoke in hushed tones. I couldn't hear what they were saying, but Karen's body language was tense, her hands gesturing animatedly. Who was this man? A lawyer? A co-conspirator? I snapped a few photos with my phone, determined to figure it out later. That night, Emily called with another update. I've been digging into Karen's finances, she said. There are some irregularities, large transfers, accounts in other states. It's not conclusive yet, but it looks like she's been moving money around. Why would she do that? I asked. Could be to hide assets, Emily said, or to make it harder to track her transactions. Either way, it's suspicious. Her words solidified what I already knew. Karen was running a game, and she thought she was untouchable. But she underestimated me. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine anymore. It was about stopping her before she could do this to anyone else. The anonymous caller had been right. I had a chance to expose Karen for what she truly was, and I wasn't going to waste it. A few days after the anonymous call, my phone buzzed with a number I recognized. Henry Barker, my dad's lawyer. I answered quickly, my heart pounding. I had been waiting for his analysis of the 2 wills, hoping for the breakthrough I needed. Hi, this is Henry, he said, his voice measured but carrying an undertone of urgency. I've reviewed the documents and compared the signatures. We need to talk. Is it bad? I asked, gripping the phone tighter. It's definitive, he said. Come to my office as soon as you can. I arrived at Henry's office within the hour, practically running from the parking lot. His receptionist greeted me with a sympathetic smile and waved me through to his office. Henry was seated at his desk, the 2 wills spread out in front of him, along with several sheets of paper covered in notes. Take a seat, he said, motioning to the chair across from him. I dropped into the chair, my nerves frayed. What did you find? Henry leaned forward, adjusting his glasses. The signature on the updated will is a forgery, he said bluntly. His words hung in the air, heavy with significance. Are you sure? I asked, though I already knew the answer. He nodded. I had a handwriting expert analyze both signatures. Your father's signature on the original will is consistent with his handwriting samples on file. But the signature on the updated will has subtle differences, slightly inconsistent slant, uneven pressure, and signs of replication. It's a forgery, without a doubt. I let out a breath I hadn't realized I was holding. This was the proof I needed, the confirmation that Karen had tampered with my dad's wishes. Henry wasn't finished. "There's more," he said, flipping through his notes. I looked into the witnesses listed on the updated will. Neither of them has any connection to your father. In fact, both of them have ties to Karen. One is an old friend of hers from college, and the other is a business associate she worked with years ago. "Are you serious?" I said, anger bubbling up. "How did no one catch this sooner?" "Karen was very convincing," Henry admitted. "She presented the will as your father's final wishes, complete with what appeared to be valid signatures and witnesses. At the time, there was no reason to doubt her. But now," he trailed off, shaking his head. I sat back, the weight of it all crashing down on me. Karen hadn't just stolen my inheritance. She had carefully and deliberately rewritten my father's legacy to suit her own needs. "What happens now?" I asked, my voice steadier than I felt. Henry folded his hands on the desk. "We have grounds to contest the will," he said. "With the original document, the handwriting analysis, and the questionable witnesses, we have a strong case. I've already started drafting the necessary paperwork to file in court." "And what happens to Karen?" "If the court rules in your favor, the original will would be reinstated. Karen could face legal consequences for fraud and forgery, possibly even criminal charges." The thought of Karen finally facing justice gave me a sense of satisfaction, but it was tempered by the gravity of the situation. This wasn't just about punishing her. It was about setting things right for my dad. That night, I couldn't stop thinking about how Karen had pulled it off. The level of planning and precision required to forge a will and manipulate witnesses was staggering. It wasn't something she could have done on a whim. As I replayed everything in my mind, a chilling realization hit me. Karen must have been planning this for months, if not longer. The timing of the updated will, just months before my dad's death, was too convenient to be a coincidence. She had likely been laying the groundwork long before he passed away. I thought back to the anonymous tip, the caller's warning about Karen's long game. They had been right. She didn't just stumble into opportunities. She created them, using charm and manipulation to get what she wanted. But this time, she had gone too far. The next few days were a blur of meetings and paperwork as Henry and I prepared to file the case. He walked me through the process, explaining how we would present the evidence to the court. "The key is to stay calm and let the facts speak for themselves," he advised. "Karen may try to twist things or play the victim, but the truth is on your side." I nodded, feeling a mix of nerves and determination. This wasn't just about reclaiming what was mine. It was about honoring my dad's memory and exposing the truth. Meanwhile, Emily continued her investigation into Karen's past. She called me one evening with another update. "I found records that Karen tried to file for additional life insurance on your father shortly before his death," she said. "The policy was denied because your dad had pre-existing health conditions, but the timing is suspicious." "Unbelievable," I muttered, my anger flaring again. "There's more," Emily said. I dug into the notary who signed off on the updated will. "They're licensed, but they've been flagged for questionable practices in the past. There's a chance Karen paid them off to certify the forged document." It was yet another piece of the puzzle, further proof that Karen had orchestrated the entire scheme. As the court date approached, I felt a strange sense of clarity. For months, I had been lost in grief and confusion, questioning myself and my relationship with my dad. But now, I had a purpose, a chance to fight for the truth and reclaim what was rightfully mine. Karen had underestimated me, thinking I would accept her lies without question. But she was about to learn just how wrong she was. This wasn't just about winning a legal battle. It was about justice for my dad and for everyone else she had hurt along the way. And I wasn't going to stop until I saw it through. The legal papers were served to Karen on a Tuesday morning. Henry made sure the documents were airtight, detailing the forgery, the handwriting analysis, and the questionable witnesses. He included every shred of evidence we had, ensuring there was no room for ambiguity. When the server delivered the papers to Karen at home, I could only imagine her reaction. I didn't have to wonder for long. Less than an hour later, my phone buzzed, Karen's name lighting up the screen. I braced myself before answering. "You little ingrate," she screamed the moment I picked up. Her voice was so shrill it made me flinch. "How dare you do this to me? After everything I've done for you. Everything you've done for me?" I shot back, my anger boiling over. "You mean lying, forging my dad's will, and trying to steal everything he left behind?" "Yeah, Karen, you've done a lot for me. You have no idea what you're talking about, she snapped. Your father wanted me to have those things. He trusted me, not you. You were barely even in his life. That last comment hit a nerve, but I refused to let her see it. Nice try, Karen, but I'm not falling for it. The evidence speaks for itself. You forged his will and manipulated the witnesses. You're not going to get away with it. She let out a bitter laugh, but there was a trace of desperation in it. Oh, please. You think a court is going to side with you? I was his wife. I took care of him. I was there for him every single day while you were off living your life. Too busy to even call him half the time. Her words stung, but I wasn't about to let her twist the truth. You can try to guilt-trip me all you want, Karen, but it doesn't change the facts. Dad didn't trust you. He locked the original will away to protect it. You just didn't count on me finding it. There was a long pause on the other end of the line. When Karen spoke again, her tone was venomous. You're just bitter because your dad loved me more than he loved you. You can't stand the fact that I was the most important person in his life, not you. I felt a surge of rage, but I forced myself to stay calm. This isn't about love, Karen. This is about what's right. You lied, you cheated, and now you're going to face the consequences. Her composure cracked completely. You're trying to ruin my life, she screamed. Do you know what this will do to me? Do you even care? I took a deep breath, steadying myself. You did this to yourself. I'm just making sure the truth comes out. Before she could say anything else, I hung up. My hands were shaking, but I felt a strange sense of relief. Karen's reaction had confirmed what I already knew. She was guilty, and she was scared. Over the next few days, Karen went into full-blown damage control. She started spreading rumors among mutual friends and family, painting herself as the victim and me as the ungrateful, greedy stepchild. All he cares about is the money, she told anyone who would listen. John would rather drag his father's memory through the mud than let me honor his wishes. It's disgusting. Some people believed her. I got a few angry texts and cold shoulders from relatives who had bought into her sob story. But others reached out with words of support, telling me they suspected something was off about Karen from the beginning. She's always been too polished, one of my cousins said over the phone. Like she's playing a part. I'm not surprised she's pulling something like this. Karen also tried to intimidate me directly. She showed up at my apartment unannounced one evening, pounding on the door. Open the door, John, she yelled. We need to talk. I peeked through the peephole and saw her standing there, her face flushed with anger. I didn't open the door. Instead, I called Emily, my private investigator, and told her what was happening. Don't engage with her, Emily advised. If she keeps showing up, document it. This kind of behavior only works in your favor. The next morning, Karen escalated again. She sent me a string of texts, alternating between pleading and threatening. You don't have to do this, John. We can figure something out. If you go through with this, you'll regret it. I'm warning you. Do you really want to destroy your father's memory over some money? Her desperation was palpable, but it only made me more determined. For years, she had gotten away with manipulating people and taking what didn't belong to her. She thought she could bully or guilt me into backing down, but she had underestimated me. I forwarded the text to Henry, who added them to our growing pile of evidence. This just shows she's feeling the pressure, he said. Stay the course. We got her cornered. Despite her bravado, Karen began to unravel. She started missing social events, and when she did show up, her usually polished appearance was noticeably frayed. A mutual friend told me she had been drinking more than usual and had lashed out at someone who dared to bring up the legal battle. She's losing it, the friend said. I don't think she knows how to handle not being in control. Hearing that gave me a sense of grim satisfaction. For so long, Karen had operated in the shadows, manipulating people and hiding behind her charm. But now, the truth was catching up to her. As the court date loomed closer, Karen's attempts to sabotage me grew more desperate. She tried to dig up dirt from my past, reaching out to old friends and even contacting my ex-girlfriend. One night, I got a call from Emily. I think Karen's trying to bribe someone connected to the case, she said. I've been following her financial activity, and there's a large withdrawal from one of her accounts that doesn't make sense. The news didn't surprise me, but it further solidified my resolve. Karen would stop at nothing to protect herself, but she was running out of moves. The next time my phone buzzed with Karen's name, I didn't answer. I was done playing her games. The evidence was on my side, and soon the court would see it too. This wasn't just about exposing Karen anymore. It was about standing up for my dad and ensuring his legacy couldn't be stolen by someone who didn't deserve it. The day of the court hearing arrived with a mix of anxiety and determination. For months, everything had been building to this moment. Karen's schemes, my discovery of the original will, the evidence we'd meticulously gathered. All of it was about to be laid bare before a judge. As I walked into the courthouse, my heart pounded in my chest, but I reminded myself that the truth was on my side. The courtroom was smaller than I expected, its walls lined with dark wood panels that gave it an air of seriousness. Karen sat at the defendant's table, her polished exterior betraying none of the chaos I knew was brewing beneath the surface. She wore a tailored black dress, her expression poised but cold. Every now and then, she glanced in my direction, her eyes narrowing as if trying to intimidate me. It didn't work. My lawyer, Henry, gave me a reassuring nod as we took our seats. "Stay calm," he reminded me. "The evidence speaks for itself." The proceedings began with the judge reviewing the case, outlining the claims we'd made. That Karen had presented a forged will, manipulated witnesses, and attempted to subvert my father's true intentions. As the judge spoke, I glanced at Karen, whose carefully crafted mask remained intact. The first blow came when Henry introduced the handwriting analysis. We'd brought in a handwriting expert to testify, a meticulous man named Dr. Greer who had decades of experience in forensic document examination. Dr. Greer took the stand and methodically explained how he'd analyzed both wills, comparing them to verified samples of my father's handwriting. "The signature on the updated will is a forgery," he said with absolute certainty. "There are clear inconsistencies in the stroke pressure, letter formation, and slant. It was likely copied or traced from an original sample." Karen's lawyer tried to poke holes in Dr. Greer's testimony, suggesting that my father's handwriting might have changed due to age or stress. But Dr. Greer held firm. While minor variations in handwriting can occur over time, the differences here are too significant to be attributed to natural variation. This is a deliberate forgery. The tension in the room was palpable. Karen shifted uncomfortably in her seat, her polished facade beginning to crack. Next, we presented the testimony of the two witnesses listed on the fraudulent will. Neither of them had appeared voluntarily. We'd had to subpoena them, but their reluctance only made their testimony more damning. The first witness, a woman named Linda, was visibly nervous as she took the stand. She admitted to being an old friend of Karen's, but claimed she hadn't read the document she was signing. Karen said it was just some routine paperwork, Linda said, wringing her hands. The second witness, a man named Tom, was more combative. He insisted he had no idea the will was fraudulent and denied any wrongdoing. But under cross-examination, he admitted that Karen had paid him a consulting fee shortly after the will was notarized. Henry didn't miss the opportunity to emphasize this point. "You were paid by Karen shortly after signing this document, correct?" Tom hesitated, his face flushing. "Yes, but it wasn't related to the will." The judge's skeptical expression said it all. The turning point came when Henry presented Karen's financial records. Emily, our private investigator, had unearthed a series of suspicious transactions, large cash withdrawals and payments to questionable third parties, that coincided with the creation of the fraudulent will. "These transactions suggest a coordinated effort to manipulate my client's inheritance," Henry argued. Karen used these funds to secure fraudulent witnesses and potentially bribe the notary who certified the will. Karen's lawyer objected, claiming the transactions were unrelated. But the evidence was too compelling to ignore. Karen finally took the stand, her demeanor oscillating between righteous indignation and feigned victimhood. "I love John more than anything," she said, her voice trembling. "I would never do anything to disrespect his wishes." But under cross-examination, her composure began to crumble. Henry pressed her on the discrepancies in the will, the payments to the witnesses, and her prior history of suspicious behavior. "Can you explain why two of your late husbands revised their wills in your favor shortly before their deaths?" Henry asked pointedly. Karen's face turned ashen. "That's irrelevant to this case," she snapped. "On the contrary," Henry replied calmly. "It establishes a pattern of behavior that calls your credibility into question." The judge allowed the line of questioning, much to Karen's dismay. She grew increasingly defensive, her answers evasive and contradictory. As the trial progressed, it became clear that Karen's carefully constructed narrative was unraveling. The evidence was overwhelming. The forged signature, the manipulated witnesses, the financial records, and even the anonymous tip, which we corroborated with Emily's findings. When it was time for closing arguments, Henry delivered a powerful statement. "This case is not just about money," he said. "It's about honoring the wishes of a man who entrusted his legacy to the people he loved." Karen betrayed that trust, and she did so with calculated intent. The evidence leaves no doubt. Justice demands that the original will be reinstated. Karen's lawyer tried to paint me as a bitter, greedy son who was trying to undermine his stepmother out of spite. But the evidence spoke louder than any accusations. The judge took several days to deliberate, during which I could barely eat or sleep. The waiting was excruciating, but I held on to the hope that the truth would prevail. Finally, the decision came. The judge ruled in my favor, reinstating the original will and invalidating the fraudulent one. Karen's actions were deemed deliberate and malicious, and she was ordered to return all assets she had wrongfully claimed. The moment the ruling was read, I felt a wave of relief wash over me. Karen sat stone-faced, her world collapsing around her. The judge also referred the case for potential criminal charges, citing evidence of forgery and fraud. As I left the courthouse that day, I felt a profound sense of closure. My dad's legacy had been restored, and Karen's web of lies had finally unraveled. But more than anything, I felt a renewed sense of purpose. This wasn't just about justice for me. It was about ensuring my father's memory remained untarnished, free from the shadows of Karen's deceit. She had played her games for far too long, but now the truth was out, and she could no longer hide. The gavel struck sharply, signaling the end of a long and grueling battle. The judge's words echoed in my mind. The original will is hereby reinstated. Karen, last name, is ordered to return all wrongfully obtained assets to the plaintiff. Additionally, this court refers the matter for further investigation into potential criminal charges of fraud and forgery. For a moment, I just sat there, letting the weight of the ruling sink in. The relief was overwhelming, but it came with an undercurrent of sadness. This victory wasn't a celebration. It was a necessary act of justice, born from betrayal and loss. Karen didn't make a scene as the verdict was read. She sat stiffly at the defense table, her once pristine image shattered. Her lawyer whispered something to her, but she didn't respond. The Karen who had exuded confidence and control was gone, replaced by someone visibly defeated. After the courtroom emptied, Henry and I sat in the quiet for a moment, letting it all settle. "You did it," he said, a small smile breaking through his usual stoic demeanor. "Your dad would be proud." I nodded, my throat tightening. "Thanks, Henry, for everything." He gave me a reassuring pat on the shoulder. "The evidence spoke for itself. You just needed to believe in it, and in yourself." The reinstatement of the original will meant that everything my dad intended for me was back in my hands. The house, his savings, and his prized vintage car. But more than that, it meant his legacy had been restored. The lies Karen tried to weave had been unraveled, and my father's true wishes were honored. Still, it was hard to ignore the scars this fight had left behind. Family relationships had been strained, some irreparably. There were people who had sided with Karen, believing her sob stories and villainizing me. Even with the court's ruling, some of them still viewed me as the aggressor, unable to reconcile the truth with their perception of Karen. But those who mattered most, my close friends, my supportive relatives, stayed by my side. They reminded me that the battle wasn't just about the inheritance. It was about protecting my father's memory and ensuring his intentions weren't erased by greed. Karen's troubles didn't end in the courtroom. Shortly after the ruling, the criminal investigation into her actions gained traction. Emily, my private investigator, had uncovered additional evidence of fraudulent activity in Karen's past. Her attempts to manipulate wills and exploit vulnerable people were far more extensive than we initially thought. I learned that the district attorney was preparing charges for forgery, fraud, and even conspiracy. Karen's days of walking away unscathed were officially over. The fallout was swift. Her social circle, once filled with people who admired her charm and sophistication, began to crumble. People distanced themselves as her true nature came to light. She had built her life on deception, and now it was all falling apart. A few weeks after the court ruling, I went back to my dad's house for the first time since the trial. The house was eerily quiet, but it felt like it was mine again, no longer tainted by Karen's presence. I walked through each room, letting memories flood back. The smell of his coffee in the mornings, the sound of his laughter echoing from the living room, the warmth of his hugs that made the world feel right. In his study, I found myself sitting at his desk, running my fingers over the wood grain. The locked drawer where I'd found the original was still intact, a silent reminder of how close I'd come to losing everything. "Hope I made you proud, Dad," I whispered. The legal victory brought closure, but it didn't erase the pain of losing my dad or the bitterness of Karen's betrayal. I realized that healing wouldn't come from the court's decision alone. It would take time, reflection, and a focus on rebuilding my life. I decided to honor my dad's memory by doing something meaningful with the inheritance. I used part of the money to set up a scholarship fund in his name, aimed at helping underprivileged students pursue their dreams. It felt like the kind of legacy he would have wanted, one rooted in kindness and giving back. I also kept his vintage car, a cherry red beauty that he'd spent years restoring. On sunny days, I'd take it for a drive, feeling closer to him with every turn of the wheel. Karen's trial for criminal charges eventually began, but by then, I had stopped following the details closely. I didn't need to see her downfall to feel closure. The judge's ruling had already given me what I needed: validation, justice, and the knowledge that my dad's trust in me hadn't been misplaced. Standing in the courtroom that day had been a bittersweet moment. I'd won, but I'd also lost so much. My dad was gone, his memory tainted by Karen's greed. But in the end, I knew he would have been proud of me for standing up for myself and for him. That knowledge made every sleepless night, every tense confrontation, and every moment of self-doubt worth it. Looking back, I realized this journey had taught me something profound. People like Karen thrive on the silence and inaction of others. By standing up to her, I not only reclaimed what was mine, but also exposed her for what she truly was. It wasn't just about fighting for my inheritance. It was about fighting for the truth. And in doing so, I found a sense of peace I didn't think was possible. As I drove down the open road in my dad's vintage car, the wind in my hair and the sun on my face, I felt a quiet sense of triumph. This was what justice felt like, not a loud victory, but a steady, enduring peace. And I knew, wherever he was, my dad was smiling.